flickering light of 18th century Paris, the world was being remade, not by kings or conquerors, but by minds. The candles burned late in rooms filled with ink and parchment, as the hum of reason began to drown the chants of superstition. It was the age of Enlightenment, when the map of the world was no longer drawn by faith, but by fact. For centuries, maps had been mirrors of imagination, filled with monsters, angels and continents born from rumor. The edges of Asia were veiled in dragons. Africa was a tapestry of empty plains and mythical cities. The Pacific, a realm of endless speculation. Yet amid this fog of invention, a young Frenchman dared to erase what he could not prove. His name was Jean-Baptiste d'Anville, and he would become the cartographer who taught Europe to doubt its own maps. He was not a man of adventure, nor of conquest. He did not cross oceans, nor climb mountains. His journeys were of the mind, voyages across libraries and archives, through ancient scrolls and merchant journals, where truth was buried beneath centuries of assumption. To him, skepticism was a compass, and accuracy was art. In the streets outside, Paris was alive with revolution, of thought, of science, of ambition. The salons whispered of Newton and Descartes, of reason as the new god of men. Yet in a small, quiet study overlooking the Seine, d'Anville fought his own revolution, one not of politics but of precision. His maps would strip away legend and illusion, revealing the world as it truly was. It was an act of rebellion in ink, a rebellion against the arrogance of certainty. The maps that once promised knowledge now stood exposed as instruments of pride and empire. d'Anville's mission was different, to bring humility to geography and honesty to empire. And so, with a quill dipped in skepticism and a mind sharpened by science, Jean-Baptiste d'Anville began to redraw the world, line by line, truth by truth, across the vast and uncertain canvas of the 18th century. Paris, in the early 1700s, was a city of restless genius. Beneath the echo of church bells and carriage wheels, ideas moved faster than empires. Within its candlelit chambers, astronomers charted the heavens, anatomists dissected the mysteries of life, and cartographers, the geographers of truth, reshaped the world's imagination. It was here, amid the pulse of Enlightenment thought, that Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville was born in 1697, into a France poised between superstition and science. From a young age, he was consumed not by adventure but by accuracy. While other boys drew castles and dragons, he drew coastlines, meticulous, measured, deliberate. His teachers at the Collège du Plessis saw in him something rare, a scholar's patience married to an artist's eye. Before he was 20, his maps were already circulating among Parisian scholars, admired for their elegance and restraint. France's intellectual heart, the Académie des Sciences, was entering its golden age. It was an era when geography was not merely a curiosity, but an instrument of empire. Monarchs sought maps to claim the world. Explorers sought them to survive it. Yet the maps of the time were still riddled with fantasy. Kingdoms misplaced, rivers imagined, coastlines guessed. d'Anville looked upon these errors not with contempt, but with determination. "Better a blank space than a falsehood," he once said. And that phrase became his creed. In his modest study near the Rue Saint-Honoré, surrounded by compasses, scrolls, and star charts, he began a lifelong quest to rebuild geography from the ground up. He worked from primary sources, ancient texts, sailors' logs, explorers' journals, missionary reports. Each piece of information was weighed like evidence in a court of law. If one account contradicted another, he sought the truth not in authority, but in reason. The world began to notice. By his 30s, d'Anville's maps were circulating across Europe, elegant works that replaced decoration with data. He stripped away allegory, erased the sea serpents and gilded borders, and replaced them with lines born from mathematics and measurement. His maps of Europe, Africa, and the Orient were soon praised by scholars and statesmen alike. But D'Anville's genius was not only in what he drew, it was in what he refused to draw. Where others filled gaps with guesswork, he left them empty, silent, honest. Those white spaces became his signature, a visual philosophy that said, "Here we do not yet know." This humility, radical in its time, transformed map-making into a science. And in a world intoxicated with certainty, Jean-Baptiste d'Anville taught that knowledge was not found in the filling of maps, but in the courage to leave them blank. As France expanded its gaze toward Asia, Africa and the Americas, the Crown sought his counsel. Explorers carried his maps aboard their ships. Ambassadors presented them to foreign courts. Yet while others saw power in his lines, d'Anville saw responsibility. For every border drawn in ink would one day be redrawn in blood. In the dim silence of his study, he understood what few dared to admit, that maps were not merely reflections of geography, but instruments of truth, empire, and imagination. And for d'Anville, the truth was sacred. By the middle of the 18th century, Jean-Baptiste d'Anville had become a quiet legend, a man whose ink carried the weight of continents. Yet his gaze turned ever eastward, toward lands that Europe scarcely understood. Asia, vast, ancient, mysterious, was the ultimate test of his method. It was a world that defied the Western imagination, a geography woven with legend and silence, where truth was buried beneath centuries of translation, error, and empire. In his study in Paris, the air thick with candle smoke and parchment dust, d'Anville bent over maps that spanned the entire breadth of Eurasia, from the frozen steppe of Siberia to the warm deltas of the Mekong. He was not a traveler. His voyages were intellectual. His ships were books, his compass the light of reason. Yet he traveled farther through archives than most men did across oceans. He studied ancient Chinese chronicles brought by Jesuit missionaries, the Kangxi Atlas, a monumental survey ordered by the Qing Emperor, produced by both Chinese scholars and European astronomers. In these pages, he saw not a mythic Orient, but a civilization that had mapped its own vastness with precision long before the Enlightenment dawned in Europe. D'Anville recognized this with reverence. He treated the Chinese measurements not as curiosities, but as data, cross-checking them with astronomical records, converting their distances into European measures, and merging them into his own vision of the world. The result was revolutionary. In 1735, he published his Nouvel Atlas de la Chine, a masterpiece that shattered centuries of misconception. For the first time, the geography of China was presented not as a dream of Marco Polo's imagination, but as a land of real coordinates, rivers, and provinces. His map was so precise that even the emperor's court in Beijing acknowledged its accuracy. It was an act of intellectual diplomacy, a moment when Europe's Enlightenment bowed, however briefly, to Asia's own cartographic tradition. Yet d'Anville's pursuit did not stop at the Great Wall. He turned his focus to India, a region whose geography had long been distorted by speculation. European maps often showed phantom rivers and invented kingdoms, shaped by rumor rather than reconnaissance. But d'Anville dissected the reports of Mughal officials, Jesuit travelers, and East India Company officers. He triangulated trade routes, recalculated latitudes, and rebuilt the subcontinent's shape with geometric clarity. His Carte de l'Inde of 1752 became the most accurate depiction of South Asia to that date, a reference point not only for scholars but for generals and colonial administrators. It was here that the paradox of his work became clear. His devotion to truth gave birth to power, The same maps that sought to illuminate were soon used to dominate. European empires, armed with D'Anville's charts, advanced their reach into territories they barely understood. His meticulous lines became blueprints for conquest, invisible instruments of empire. And yet, in the solitude of his study, D'Anville remained removed from the political machinery his work enabled. To him, the map was not a weapon, but a mirror, one that reflected humanity's attempt to comprehend its own vastness. He was fascinated not by borders, but by the continuity of land, the flow of rivers that connected civilizations, the mountain ranges that shaped migration and myth alike. He turned next to Africa, a continent often portrayed as a blank space in European atlases. But where others saw absence, D'Anville saw potential. He gathered ancient accounts from Ptolemy, Arab geographers, and modern explorers. He stripped away centuries of distortion and produced in 1749 one of the most honest maps of Africa yet printed, one that admitted what Europe did not know. Whole regions were left uncolored, labeled only parties inconnus. It was not an act of ignorance, but of integrity. In his lifetime, D'Anville would publish more than 200 maps, each one a monument to skepticism and precision. His Atlas General became the Enlightenment's definitive geography of the known world. From the Arctic seas to the jungles of Siam, from the sands of Arabia to the plateaus of Tibet, his name came to stand for cartographic truth. But behind the elegance of his maps was a man burdened by the very weight of knowledge. In his later years, the Paris he had once inspired began to shift toward revolution, toward impatience. The Enlightenment's calm pursuit of reason was giving way to the restless hunger for power. And amid that noise, the voice of the humble mapmaker grew quiet. Still, in his silence, the world he had redrawn endured. His vision of geography, rooted not in fantasy but in evidence, became the foundation of modern cartography. To trace his maps today is to trace the first breath of the scientific world we now inhabit. By the late 1750s, the world that Jean-Baptiste D'Anville had so carefully measured began to measure him in return. The Enlightenment, once a radiant dawn of inquiry, was turning into a theater of ambition. Empires grew hungry for the lands his ink had clarified, and kings desired not just maps, but mastery. In this age of restless discovery, D'Anville stood apart, a skeptic among conquerors, a scholar among merchants of empire. In Paris, the salons glittered with conversation. Philosophers debated reason, astronomers redefined the heavens, and explorers returned from distant coasts bearing the scent of new continents. Yet D'Anville remained in his dimly lit study, his fingers stained with ink, his candle trembling beside a stack of manuscripts. To him, truth was not born in applause or conquest. It emerged slowly, like the contour of a mountain beneath morning light. He distrusted speculation, the intoxicating kind that filled atlases with imaginary lakes, golden cities and mountains that no one had ever seen. Where certainty ends, he wrote, there the map must end. His skepticism was not a denial of mystery. It was a discipline, a way of preserving honesty in an age addicted to expansion. This philosophy was revolutionary. For centuries, mapmakers had drawn with faith where facts faltered. They embellished unknown coasts with monsters, filled deserts with oases, and drew rivers to connect imaginary lands. D'Anville refused. His maps often looked incomplete, vast spaces uncolored, coastlines broken by question marks. But this incompleteness was his signature. It told the viewer, here, we do not yet know. To him, that admission was sacred. It was a declaration that knowledge had limits, that even the Enlightenment, in all its confidence, was still only beginning to understand the world. In that humility, D'Anville became a moral cartographer, a rare figure who understood that maps could both reveal and deceive. His contemporaries were not always kind. Some called his maps barren, others unfinished. But for the thinkers of the next century, his method became scripture. Alexander von Humboldt, the great explorer-scientist, studied his work before venturing into South America. The geographers of Napoleon's empire, men who sought to redraw the world through force, used his maps as their foundation. Even centuries later, scholars in Beijing, Calcutta, and London would find their own geographies reflected in the coordinates D'Anville had first defined. And yet, he remained untouched by fame. He declined royal honors, refused courtly titles, and lived quietly in Paris's Rue du Bac until his death in 1782. His final years were spent not in triumph, but in reflection. Around him, Europe was changing, revolutions stirred, monarchies trembled, and the rational order of the Enlightenment began to fracture beneath the weight of its own contradictions. D'Anville died believing that his maps were never complete, that the earth was still, in part a mystery to be earned, not conquered. He left behind not an empire of land, but an empire of accuracy. His collection, over 9,000 maps, manuscripts, and globes, would become one of France's greatest treasures, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale. It was his silent monument, an atlas of truth in a century obsessed with illusion, but his legacy reached beyond parchment. He had redefined what it meant to draw the world. Before him, maps were tools of kings. After him, they became instruments of science. He replaced imagination with measurement, arrogance with evidence. His lines no longer proclaimed dominion. They invited humility. There was poetry in his restraint. In refusing to draw what he could not verify, D'Anville captured something eternal. That the world's beauty lies not in its boundaries, but in its vastness. He understood that geography was not merely the study of land, but the story of how humanity learns to see. And so, as the Enlightenment faded into revolution and empire, D'Anville's quiet rebellion endured. His skepticism became a form of faith. Faith in truth, in patience, in the slow unfolding of discovery. His maps, stripped of fantasy, taught the world to look again, not through the lens of conquest, but through the eyes of wonder. Even now, in archives and digital libraries, his maps remain astonishingly modern. They breathe restraint, precision, and respect. They whisper the humility of a man who refused to claim certainty where the world was still silent. His hand, steady across centuries, reminds us that knowledge, real knowledge, is not the conquest of mystery, but the courage to admit that it still exists. As the 18th century ebbed into the 19th, the candlelight of the Enlightenment began to flicker beneath the gathering winds of revolution, industry, and empire. Yet amid the chaos of new ideologies and the shifting borders of nations, the work of Jean-Baptiste d'Anville remained untouched by time, a monument not of stone or steel, but of intellect and humility. His maps, spread across tables in palaces and academies, whispered of a truth beyond power, that knowledge, when stripped of vanity, becomes the purest form of discovery. He had shown the world that to understand it, one must first doubt it. That's skepticism. Not arrogance is the true compass of the mind. Where others filled the voids with dragons and conjecture, he filled them with silence. A silence that spoke of curiosity, patience, and reverence for evidence. The empty spaces he preserved on his maps were not failures but frontiers. They invited others to venture forth, to measure, to learn, to correct. In those blank spaces lay the promise of all that humanity had yet to know, and so his legacy endured, not as the grand conqueror of unknown worlds, but as their quiet custodian. Explorers carried his maps across oceans. Missionaries traced his coastlines through jungles, and scholars in Beijing and London alike cited his charts as foundations upon which new geographies were built. To this day, the clarity of his method echoes through every satellite image, every global survey, every digital chart that plots the contours of Earth with near-perfect precision. In Danville's world, the map was never just a mirror of power. It was a reflection of truth. He believed that to map the world honestly was to serve humanity, not empire. And perhaps that is why his spirit still lingers. In every accurate border, in every measured coastline, in every quiet acknowledgement that what we do not yet know is as sacred as what we have already found. From the crowded streets of Enlightenment Paris to the far edges of the Asian continent, his ink flowed like the arteries of reason, connecting scholars and explorers across continents and generations. His was not a life of adventure in the usual sense, yet through patience and intellect he traveled further than most men could dream. And in the long journey of human knowledge, Jean-Baptiste d'Anville stands as a kind of cartographic philosopher, a man who dared to erase in order to enlighten, who found meaning not in the fullness of the map, but in its empty spaces. His work reminds us that truth is never conquered. It is approached. It is the horizon itself, always receding, always inviting, always waiting for the next explorer to step beyond the known. As the modern world gazes down from satellites and digital atlases, perhaps we might pause and remember the scholar who once bent over parchment in a Parisian room, lit only by the flame of reason. The man who taught us that maps, like minds, are only perfect when they remain open, for it was not through conquest, but through curiosity that Jean-Baptiste d'Anville mapped the world. And in doing so, he mapped the very essence of enlightenment itself.